Welcome back to week 4 of our series Origins. So far we've walked through the first 33 chapters of the Old Testament, all in the book of Genesis. And so far we've looked at creation, we've looked at the fall, we've looked at Noah, and we've looked at Abraham. And today we're just continuing that story of God's people. It's our story. Today we're going to start with a guy we talked about a little bit last week. And we're going to talk about Isaac. Isaac is Abraham's son that was almost sacrificed on a mountain in Moriah, but God came in and saw the faith of Abraham and was faithful to his promise and saved Isaac. Well, after they leave that mountain, Isaac grows up and becomes a man of God himself. In Genesis chapter 26, we see God appear to Isaac and say, "Hey, Isaac, do you remember the promise that I gave to your father Abraham? That I would bless you, that you would be a great nation, that your descendants would outnumber the stars in the sky? I'm upholding that promise to you." He says, "My promises remain true. I'm going to make your family great. You're going to outnumber the stars in the sky. This land that I've promised you, you will enter into it." Immediately, God affirms his promise that he made to Abraham to his son Isaac. Isaac is obedient to this promise, and it turns out Isaac eventually has 2 kids of his own. He has Esau and Jacob. Now, I have 4 brothers myself, so I understand that sibling rivalry is a thing, and we can pick on our siblings at times. But today's passage that we're going to talk about Jacob a lot, and man, Jacob and Esau bicker a lot. I was talking to Mark about this passage, this story, and he said that this passage is a perfect case study in dysfunction. Today is going to get messy. So buckle up. This is going to be a crazy, crazy ride today as we look at Jacob. So the dysfunction between Jacob and Esau starts when one day Esau, the older brother, has been out working in the field. And he comes in and Jacob has been making lunch. And he has this stew, and it looks and it smells absolutely delicious. Well, Esau is really hungry because he's been out working, and so he says, "Jacob, will you pour me a bowl of that food?" And Jacob sees an opportunity, and he says, "I'll give you a bowl of the food if you give me your birthright." What's a birthright? You see, Esau was the older son, and so the birthright, the blessing, the best of everything that Isaac had would go to Esau because Esau is the oldest. So Jacob says, "Give me your blessing. I'll give you this bowl of food." Now, this is not really a fair trade at all, but Esau is so hungry that he gives up the birthright for a bowl of food. That's a pretty terrible trade. He must have been really, really hungry. After he recovers from being hungry, after he finishes the bowl of food, he realizes how dumb of a mistake that was. And he's mad at his younger brother Jacob. Well, a couple weeks, months, years later, we don't really know how long, we get this image, and Isaac at this point is old. He's kind of going blind. He's laying in a bed all day. Like, he is really old. He's like Grandpa Joe from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Well, he's laying in bed, and he calls for Esau. He says, "Esau, I don't know how many more days on earth I have. Will you go out and hunt and bring me back food? Make me this delicious meal, and I will give you my blessing." It's a big deal. So Esau goes, and he goes out to hunt, and Rebekah, Isaac's wife, hears it. And her favorite son is Jacob. So she calls Jacob. She's like, "Hey, come here real quick. Your dad just asked your brother Esau to go out and hunt and make this delicious meal. And if he does, he'll get your father's blessing." And Jacob's like, "What am I supposed to do with this information?" So she's like, "Okay, here's the plan. I'm going to make this delicious meal. you're going to walk in and you're going to give it to your dad, claiming to be Esau, and then he will give you the blessing and everything will be good, Jacob. And Jacob says, okay, that sounds awesome, but there's one problem. It tells us that Esau is really hairy, like really hairy, and Jacob is not. And so Jacob says, I'm going to go in, and he's going to realize right away that it's me, Jacob, and not Esau. So Rebekah says, all right, we're going to take these furs and we're going to put them on your arms so that when you walk in and you give the bowl of food, he'll touch your arm and he'll feel the fur and he'll think it's Esau. First off, how hairy is Esau if fur can be passed off as his arms? Esau must be like Sasquatch. Well, Jacob does it. He puts the fur on his arms, he walks in, and he gives the bowl of food to Isaac, and Isaac thinks it's Esau, and so he blesses Jacob. Esau comes back from the field, he's made food, and he walks into Isaac, and he gives it to Isaac, and Isaac is like, who are you? And he's like, I'm Esau. And Isaac said, Esau was just in here, and he just gave me food, and I just blessed him, and in an instant, Esau knows what's happened. Esau knows that Jacob has tricked him again. And he's stolen something that was rightfully Esau's. So Esau would have had the blessing and the birthright. Now he has neither. And he's upset. And he starts begging Isaac. He says, well, it was an accident. Can't you just give me your blessing? Like, he stole it. And Isaac says, my hands are tied. I've already given over my blessing. You've already given up your birthright. I can't do anything about it. So he basically tells Esau, hey, you know your younger brother? You're now supposed to submit to him as if he was the older brother, as if he was the one that has authority, because now he does. Esau does not like it. And he gets so mad at Jacob that it says that he wants to kill him. So he starts to chase down Jacob, and Rebekah, again, comes to Jacob's rescue and says, hey, your brother's about to kill you. So you need to take off. You need to run. You need to get out of here. I have a brother, Laban. You need to go stay with Laban, and you'll be protected. You'll be safe. And so Jacob takes off, and he goes to be with Laban. On Jacob's way to Laban, he stops for the night, and he has this dream. And it's a crazy, crazy dream. Let me read it for you. It's Genesis 28. It starts in verse 12. It said, and Jacob dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Jacob, in the middle of the desert, has this encounter with God in a dream in which God looks at Jacob and he reaffirms the covenant yet again. The covenant that he made with Abraham, the covenant that he reaffirmed with Isaac, and now he's reaffirming it again with Jacob. He says, Jacob, the land that your head is on right now, I will give to you. I will not rest until my promises to you have been fulfilled. Well, Jacob wakes up the next day and he continues his journey to Laban. Eventually he gets to Laban, and as he arrives at Laban's, he sees this beautiful girl out in the field. And he's immediately drawn to her. Well, he goes to Laban and he says, hey, I am your nephew, essentially. I am Rebekah's son, Jacob. And he said, my mom sent me to you, and I would love to work with you and stay with you. Laban responds, he says, that sounds great. How will I ever pay you for working here and staying with me? And Jacob says, hey, I saw a really beautiful woman out in the field. I would love for her to be my wife." And Laban says, "Oh, that's my daughter Rachel. We can do that." And so he says, "You're going to work for me for 7 years. At the end of those 7 years, you can marry Rachel," which is his cousin. So he does it. Jacob works for 7 years. And at the end of those 7 years comes wedding day. And he's excited. And they have this ceremony. And they go to consummate the marriage. And he wakes up the next morning and realizes that it is not Rachel that is laying next to him. It's Rachel's ugly sister named Leah. It's Rachel's older sister. Laban has tricked Jacob. So Jacob goes to Laban and he's furious. And Laban said, "Sorry, man, I gotcha. If you want to marry Rachel, you can work with me for another 7 years." And Jacob does that. He works for another 7 years and finally marries this girl, Rachel, that he really loves. He waited 14 years to marry this one girl. She must be special. Well, each time that Jacob married one of Laban's sons, Laban gave over a servant to be with them. So now Jacob has 2 wives, and there are 2 servants in their house. And it comes time for kids to enter the picture. And so Jacob and Rachel try to have a kid, and they're not successful. Well, Jacob and Leah start having kids and kids and kids, and they have 4 kids really quickly. Rachel doesn't like this, and so she gives her servant over to Jacob, and he starts having kids with Rachel's servant. Well, Leah doesn't like this, and so she gives her servant, and Jacob starts having kids with her servant. And then Rachel and Jacob finally have a kid, and when all is said and done, they have 12 sons and a couple daughters. That's a lot of kids. And he's having kids with 4 different women. It's a little messed up. They give these kids all kinds of wild names like Asher and Zebulun and Gad and Judah and Levi and Dan. The only reason that I know all of the kids of Jacob who end up becoming the tribes of Israel, the only reason I know their names is not because I went to Bible college, but when I was in high school, I dated a girl whose brothers were all named after the tribes of Israel. So Jacob has lots of kids. He has 2 wives. He has 2 baby mamas. And things are getting crazy. He realizes one day, hey, I want to go back home. And so he goes to Laban and he says, hey, I want to pack up my kids and my wives and I want to take off and I want to go home. And Laban basically tells him no. And so in the middle of the night, Jacob rounds up all of his kids and his wives and his servants and he takes off. And he steals a couple things from Laban as well. And he goes and Laban wakes up and he realizes what's happened. And so he takes off after Jacob to confront him. On his way, the Lord appears to Laban and basically tells him, let Jacob go. Like, can talk to him, but let him go. And so they interact, and Jacob admits that he didn't handle things well, and Laban admits that he didn't really handle things well, and he finally lets Jacob and his family go. Well, here's what's funny. As Jacob gets closer and closer to home, he starts to remember, oh yeah, my brother is going to be waiting for me. And he gets word that Esau is set up with hundreds of men ready for Jacob. So Jacob is scared. He sends a gift ahead of him and hopes that it'll soften the blow. But then Jacob, for the first time in this story, finally turns to God. See, up until this point, Jacob has been doing whatever he wants without giving a second thought to God. God has been faithful in upholding his promises, but Jacob, up until this point, has done only what Jacob wants to do. Until now. Jacob turns to the Lord in prayer. Here's what Jacob is doing. He's going to the Lord and saying, look, I have not lived my life in a way that honors you. He said, "In no way do I deserve your faithfulness, Lord. You have been so good to me. I don't deserve anything that you've given me." He repents. He acknowledges his own sin. And then he begs God for deliverance. He said, "God, I'm scared of what my brother is going to do to me. I'm scared that my brother is angry at me, and for good reason. God, will you deliver me? You are the only one that can deliver me." And this is the first moment that we have seen Jacob be faithful and honest and vulnerable and turn to the Lord. That moment of vulnerability is immediately followed up with what just caps off the whole story of Jacob. In Genesis chapter 32, starting in verse 22, Jacob has a crazy encounter with God. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. So Jacob is alone, and all of a sudden, a man just starts wrestling with Jacob. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and instantly Jacob's hip was put out of joint, and he wrestled with him. Okay, crazy story, lots to explain. Jacob takes his family, crosses them over the river. Then he immediately starts wrestling with this guy, and the guy touches his hip socket, and his hip goes out of socket, and they keep wrestling all night until the morning. And what's actually happening here is Jacob is wrestling with God himself. He's wrestling with God. He's trying to gain control, and he's wrestling with God. Well, in the midst of wrestling with God, he's banged up along the way. He is not winning by any means. In the midst of this, God gives Jacob a new name. He calls him Israel. He says, "You have striven to walk with God." He says, "Jacob, for the first time, you've come to me. For the first time, you're trying to figure out what it means to follow me. And so you are a new man, Jacob. You're now Israel." The nation of Israel, the Israelites that we see, come from Jacob's line. Jacob is Israel. His sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. This is a big, big moment. In Genesis 33, we come to the big conclusion of this whole story. Jacob is heading home toward Esau. Esau gets word that Jacob has sent this offering, and he rejects it. And as they get close, Esau and Jacob see each other, and rather than come and attack Jacob, Esau runs toward him, and he wraps him up, and he gives him a hug. He's forgiven Jacob. And I have no doubt in my mind that the reason that Esau has forgiven Jacob is because the Lord softened his heart. Jacob approached the Lord and said, "God, will you rescue me?" And guess what? He did. He softened Esau's heart. Esau welcomes him in, and things are restored. Okay, so at this point, you're probably asking this question. What on earth can we learn from this? This is like a soap opera. This is like Game of Thrones. Like, this is crazy stuff. What can we learn from it? That's a very justified question. This is crazy. But I think there are some important takeaways. The first thing that you need to know from this story is pretty simple. And it defines the entire story. God can use some really messy people and some messy situations for his good. God uses Jacob, this mess of a man, and he uses him, eventually we'll see, to bless the nations through his sons and through this nation of Israel that comes from his line. He blesses him so that they will be a blessing to the nations. God uses this messy, messy, messy person in order to do good. He still does. I am an absolute mess of a person, but God still wants to use me. God used messy people, and he still does. No one is too messy for God to use. We see God use prostitutes. We see God use tax collectors and thieves. If God can use them, God can use you. You are not too messy. God is great at taking horrible situations and restoring them into something good. And that's what we see God do here. The second thing I want to point out is that Jacob, after living this life that only pleased himself, Jacob turns to God in prayer and repents. He's humble, he's honest, he's vulnerable. For the first time in his life, he goes to the Lord and he lays out everything. He says, I have not lived a life the way that I should. He repents of it. He's honest, he's vulnerable, and that's the same posture we should take. We should approach God completely vulnerable. God, this is what I've done. This is where I've missed the mark. Will you forgive me? Will you allow me to live in a way that honors and pleases you? Jacob is vulnerable. Jacob is not a great dude, and there's not a ton of good things that we can learn from him, but it's only when he approaches God in honesty and vulnerability that things start to change in his life. It's all spurred on by repentance, by admitting I've gotten it wrong, and God, I need you to forgive me. That is the turning point in Jacob's life. And that's a moment that we need to come to regularly, to vulnerably, honestly, humbly approach God and say, hey, God, I've messed it up. I've missed the mark. Will you forgive me? The third thing I want to point out is Jacob wrestled with God. And it's okay. Jacob wrestled with God physically, and we're not going to wrestle with God physically, but oftentimes we wrestle with God for control over our lives. We wrestle through doubts. We wrestle through fears. We wrestle through all kinds of things with God. And I'm here to remind you that it's okay to do that. That it's okay to work through your doubts and your fears and your anxieties with God. In fact, that's the only place that we should be working those things out is with God. But I'm here to tell you, God will always win. You will not wrestle with God and walk away victorious. Jacob walked away with a dislocated hip. So yes, it's okay to wrestle through and ask God tough questions. But I'm here to remind you, God will always win, as he should. And I promise you'll be better off because of it. There's one last thing I want to point out, and it's kind of a small detail, but I don't want to gloss over it. Forgiveness is always better than resentment. And that's what we see with Jacob and Esau at the end. We would say that Esau had every right to be upset with Jacob. Jacob had stolen several things that belonged to Esau. But instead, Esau forgave his brother. He welcomed him back in with a hug. Reconciliation, restoration, forgiveness, those are kingdom characteristics. There's no canceling of people in the kingdom of God. Forgiveness is always better than resentment. Nowhere is that made more clear than the way that God has forgiven us. We have in so many ways and so many times sinned against God and done horrible, horrible things to him. Things that we would say give him the right to be resentful toward us, to not forgive us. But God, in his faithfulness, in his mercy, has forgiven us. Forgiveness is the way that we live in the kingdom of God. Not resentment, not canceling others, but forgiving them. In this story, Jacob is not the hero. Jacob is not faithful. Jacob does not live a life that we should emulate. This story is about God's faithfulness. God is still blessing his people even though they are not faithful, because God made a promise and God keeps his promises.